Kale had once been a master blacksmith, revered throughout the galaxy for his skill with metal. People would travel for weeks to have him forge the perfect sword or armor. But now, Kale was just a shadow of his former self. The glory days had long passed, replaced by the ruin of war. The great cities of his homeworld lay in ruins, reduced to dust by the invading alien empire. Kyle's forge was one of the last standing buildings in the crumbling city. The roof had caved in years ago, and the once bright fires in the hearth had dimmed to mere embers. He sat hunched over an old workbench, his once strong hands now trembling with age. The tools that had once shaped the finest weapons in the galaxy were rusting, neglected. He had no desire to continue his work. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. The sound of footsteps echoed through the wreckage outside. Kyle barely looked up. He had long ago learned to ignore the footsteps of those who came to his shop. There was no one left to buy anything from him. Everyone was too busy fighting for survival. But today was different. The footsteps grew louder, and Kyle heard the sharp clink of armor. Soldiers. They were not the usual scavengers or deserters. These steps were heavy with purpose. A man in tattered armor entered the forge, dragging a young girl behind him. She was barely conscious, her face pale, her body trembling as though she were made of glass. She was an alien, her skin a pale shade of blue, and her eyes were barely open. The man looked desperate, his voice a hoarse whisper as he called out to Kyle. "Please, you have to help her." Kyle raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His eyes flicked over to the girl, but he quickly turned away. He had no interest in helping anyone, especially not now. The galaxy had abandoned him, and his only concern was surviving the day. The man dropped to his knees beside Kale's workbench. "She's the last of her people," the man said, his voice shaking. "They're all gone. She's our only hope. We need you to fix this." Kyle looked down at the girl. She was wearing what appeared to be a royal uniform, marked with intricate designs that Kale recognized as the insignia of a now-destroyed alien empire. She was no older than 17, but her face was etched with pain far beyond her years. The man placed something heavy on the workbench. It was a sword, but not just any sword. Kyle could see it was broken, shattered into several jagged pieces. The sword's hilt was decorated with strange symbols, and the metal shimmered faintly. Even in its broken state, this sword, it's her people's weapon, the man explained. It's the only thing left that can stop the Empire. It's the only chance we have to save her. To save everyone. Kyle frowned. He didn't want to get involved. He didn't care about wars or revolutions. He had lost too much already. Why should he risk his life for someone else, especially someone from a species he didn't even know? The man's voice grew softer, more desperate. "Please, we've come so far. Without her, we're all doomed." The girl's eyes fluttered open just for a moment. She met Kale's gaze, and he saw something in her eyes, something raw, something powerful. It wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was a quiet plea. A silent hope that this broken, forgotten world still had something left to offer. Kale sighed and stood up, looking at the girl and the broken sword. He had not felt hope in years, but something about her presence stirred. Something deep within him, something he had buried long ago. "Fine," Kale muttered, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "I'll help. But I'm not promising miracles." The man's face lit up with relief. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." Kyle nodded, though he didn't share the man's enthusiasm. He picked up the broken sword, weighing it in his hands. It felt strange, as though it wasn't just a weapon, but something more. Something ancient. The metal was unlike anything he had ever worked with. It was resilient, but fragile at the same time, as if it had once been forged. By a power greater than any Kale could imagine, he set the pieces of the sword on the workbench, eyeing them carefully. There was no simple way to fix something so damaged, but Kale was a master blacksmith, and he had rebuilt countless weapons in his time. He could do this. It would take time and patience, but he could make this sword whole again. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to save her. But as Kale prepared to begin his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary repair. There was something about the sword, something about the girl, that made him wonder if this simple task would change the course of history. The forge was quiet now, save for the soft clink of Kyle's tools and the steady hiss of his hammer striking metal. The broken sword lay in front of him, pieces scattered like a shattered dream. He knew what needed to be done. It wasn't the first time he had worked with damaged weapons, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a sword. It was the last hope of an entire galaxy. And somehow, it felt like Kale was also holding his own chance at redemption in his hands. The girl, Lyra, lay on a cot in the corner of the forge, her eyes closed in a feverish sleep. Her breathing was shallow, and Kale could see the strain of her battle with death. Her skin had a strange, otherworldly glow to it, even in the dim light of the forge. Kale tried not to look at her, tried not to think about the impossible task ahead of him. He had always been just a blacksmith, nothing more. But now, he felt like a reluctant hero, standing at the edge of a cliff, wondering whether he would fall or find his way. Kale worked in silence, focusing on the pieces of the sword. He had already noticed the strange markings on the blade. It wasn't the typical craftsmanship he was used to. The metal had an unnatural gleam, almost like it was alive, and the designs etched into it spoke of something ancient. It was as if the sword had been forged with a purpose far greater than Kale could understand. For hours, Kale hammered and shaped the pieces, welding the jagged fragments back together. Sweat dripped down his brow and his muscles ached from the relentless work. Every strike of the hammer seemed to echo in the empty forge, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As the sword slowly began to take shape, Kyle could feel something stirring within him. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years: hope. He didn't know why, but the broken sword and the girl's story seemed to ignite something inside him. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're really going to do it, aren't you?" Kale didn't look up. "I don't have much of a choice," he muttered. "She's dying, and this sword is the only thing that can save her. If I can fix it, maybe she has a chance." The man who had brought Lyra, a soldier named Joran, had been pacing nervously around the forge. He was clearly on edge, glancing at the door as if expecting an attack at any moment. The war with the Empire had left everyone in constant fear. But Kale was used to this. The tension, the waiting. It was part of the life he had known for years. Joran's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "You don't know what you're working on, do you? This sword, it's not just a weapon, it's a key. It holds the power to destroy the Empire. The people who made it, they were more than just warriors. They were part of an ancient order." Kale paused, his hammer stilling mid-air. He had heard of such things, ancient orders, forgotten powers, but he had always dismissed them as myths. Now, though, the sword in front of him seemed to tell a different story. "I don't know about orders or keys," Kale said, returning to his work. "But I know weapons, and this sword, it's special. I can feel it." Joran stepped closer, his eyes watching Kale's every move. "It was forged by the ancestors of Lyra's people. The blade is a symbol of their strength, their courage. It's meant to wield the energy of the stars themselves. But only someone worthy can unlock its full potential." Kale raised an eyebrow. He had never believed in things like fate or destiny, but as he held the sword in his hands, he felt a strange connection to it, as though something was calling to him, urging him to finish what he had started. "I don't care about destiny," Kale muttered. "I just care about fixing this sword. If it can save her, that's all I need to know." Joran was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke again, his voice softer. "You're a good man, Kale. You don't have to believe in destiny to do something." "Great. Sometimes we just have to do what's right." Kale didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue. His mind was consumed by the task at hand. The sword, the girl, the weight of it all pressed down on him. But there was something else, too. Something that he hadn't felt in years. A spark of purpose. As the day turned to night, Kyle continued his work. The hours blurred together. The pieces of the sword were slowly but surely coming together. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when Kale thought he might have made a mistake, moments when the pieces wouldn't fit, when the blade seemed to resist his efforts. But he refused to give up. There was no going back now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sword was whole again. Kale stepped back, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He had done it. The blade glowed faintly in the dim light of the forge, its surface smooth and unbroken. But there was something else. Something that Kale couldn't explain. It wasn't just the physical form of the sword that had changed. It was as if the blade had become something more, something alive. He lifted it carefully, testing its weight. It felt right in his hands, balanced and strong. But as he held it, a strange energy surged through him, and for a moment he could feel the power of the stars, as though the blade had unlocked something deep within him. It was then that Lyra stirred. Her eyes fluttered open and she looked directly at Kale. For the first time, he saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. She was still weak, but there was a spark of life in her eyes. "The sword," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You fixed it." Kyle nodded slowly. "It's done. You're not out of danger yet, but I've done what I can." Lyra smiled faintly. "You've done more than I ever could have hoped." Kyle stood there holding the sword, and for the first time in years, he felt like something more than just a blacksmith. He felt like he had a purpose again, and maybe, just maybe, that purpose would change everything. The quiet of the forge was broken by the sudden sound of heavy footsteps outside. Kyle froze, the sword still in his hands. Lyra, still weak from her injuries, sat up slowly, her eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Kale set the sword down on the workbench and motioned for her to remain quiet. The faint sound of armor scraping against the stone floor reached his ears, followed by low voices. His instincts, honed over years of living in a world that had lost all semblance of peace, told him something was wrong. The footsteps weren't the usual shuffle of a scavenger or a deserter. These steps were too deliberate, too controlled. He walked to the door and peeked through a small crack in the ruined walls. His heart sank. A group of soldiers, armed with energy rifles and wearing dark helmets, moved stealthily across the ruined city. They were part of the Empire's elite strike force, the ones sent to eliminate any threat before it could rise. Kyle's hand instinctively moved toward the blade on the workbench, but he knew there was no time to prepare. The Empire's soldiers were closing in on the forge. He needed to act quickly. "Joran," Kale called quietly over his shoulder, but the soldier was already moving toward the back of the forge, his face tense with fear. "Get Lyra to safety." "I'll hold them off." Joran shook his head, his voice urgent. "No, you can't. They'll kill you. We need you here, Kale. We need the sword. You're the only one who can stop them." Kale's jaw tightened. "If they find us here, they'll kill us all. It's not just the sword they're after, it's her too. We don't have time to argue. Take her and go." Joran hesitated, his eyes flicking between Kale and Lyra. But there was no time to waste. He grabbed Lyra's arm and helped her to her feet. She was still unsteady, but there was a fire in her eyes. She wouldn't give up. "Not now." "Go!" Kyle urged, his voice sharp. "I'll buy you time." With one last look, Joran helped Lyra out the back, disappearing into the ruins of the city. Kyle watched them go, then turned to face the door. The soldiers were almost there. He quickly grabbed a few of his old tools and placed them in a bag. Nothing fancy, just enough to create some distractions. Then he lifted the sword, feeling its weight in his hands. The blade was heavy, but it felt alive in his grasp, as though it responded to his touch. He didn't know how to explain it, but the moment he held the sword, he felt connected to something much greater than himself. It was as if the blade had awakened a part of him he had long forgotten, a part of him that had once fought for something bigger than survival. He had forged this weapon, but now it was forging him into something new. The soldiers were close. Now. Kyle's heart pounded, but his hands were steady as he moved toward the door. He didn't know how long he could hold them off, but he knew he couldn't let them find Lyra. He crouched behind the remnants of a collapsed wall and waited. The soldiers' voices grew louder, and the sound of boots on rubble echoed through the silent city. Kale clenched his jaw and prepared himself. The first soldier appeared, walking into the forge's open area. He was tall, his face hidden behind a dark helmet. His weapon was raised, scanning the area as he moved forward. Kyle could feel the tension in the air, the stillness before the storm. The soldier moved closer, and Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The man was within range, one quick strike, and Kale could take him out. But just as Kale prepared to move, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. A low voice, a whisper coming from the shadows. "Get down!" Kale didn't hesitate. He dropped to the ground, just as a blast of energy shot past his head. The soldier's rifle crackled, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. Kyle rolled behind the broken wall, narrowly avoiding the second blast. The soldiers had seen him. They knew he was there now. He gripped the sword tightly, his mind racing. He needed a plan. Kyle had faced battles before, but this was different. The enemy wasn't just outnumbering him. They were skilled, trained to hunt down threats before they could strike back. But Kale wasn't going to let that stop him. The soldiers were getting closer, their movements methodical as they searched for him. They were close now, just on the other side of the wall. Kale's heart thudded in his chest as he waited for the perfect moment. Then it came. One of the soldiers stepped too close to his position. Kale sprang to his feet, his body moving instinctively. With a swift motion, he swung the sword, the blade, slicing through the air with a hum of energy. The soldier barely had time to react before Kale's strike knocked him off balance. The soldier fell, and Kale quickly disarmed him. Before he could catch his breath, another soldier rounded the corner. Kale was ready this time. He swung the blade again, faster this time, the weight of it carrying him forward. The soldier blocked the strike with his rifle, but the impact was enough to send him stumbling backward. Kyle didn't hesitate. He followed through, pushing the soldier back with a force he didn't know he had. The soldier's helmet clanged to the ground as Kale knocked him unconscious. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their eyes wide as they saw their comrades fall. But Kyle wasn't done. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something greater than himself. For Lyra. For the galaxy. The soldiers regrouped and started to surround him, but Kale's movements were swift. With every swing of the blade, he felt more connected to its power. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a force. And Kale was learning how to wield it. In the distance, he heard the sound of an engine starting. Lyra and Joran were escaping. They were safe for now. But Kale's battle was far from over. Kale stood in the center of the ruined city, the last of the Empire's soldiers lying unconscious at his feet. His chest heaved with every breath, and his hands trembled not from the fight, but from the sheer energy that surged through him. The sword, still gripped tightly in his hand, hummed with power. Kale could feel it, not just in the blade, but in his own body. It was as if the sword had awakened something deep inside him, something that had lain dormant for years. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at the soldiers who had fallen. The city was eerily quiet now, save for the distant sound of the wind carrying debris through the streets. The battle was over, but Cale couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had defended the forge, but Lyra was still out there. And the enemy wasn't going to stop just because one small group of soldiers had been defeated. They would send more. They always did. Cale looked down at the sword in his hands again. The weapon was no longer just a tool to him. It was more than that. The ancient markings on the blade, the way it seemed to vibrate with energy. It all made sense now. This sword was meant for something greater than just battle. It was the key to unlocking the power that could defeat the Empire. But Cale didn't know how to harness that power. Not yet. He sheathed the sword at his side and took a deep breath. He had to find Lyra. She was the one who could guide him, the one who knew the true significance of the weapon. Without her, Cale was just a man holding a powerful sword. Nothing more. He hurried through the streets, his heart pounding in his chest. The city was deserted now, the once bustling marketplace nothing more than a graveyard of broken stalls and empty buildings. The war had torn everything apart, leaving only destruction in its wake. Cale's thoughts wandered briefly to the past, to the days before the invasion, when the world had been alive with hope. Now, there was nothing left but the fight for survival. As he made his way through the ruins, Cale couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. He had no idea where Joran and Lyra had gone, but he knew they wouldn't have left without a plan. They had to be somewhere close. If he didn't catch up to them soon, the Empire would find them first, and Kyle couldn't let that happen. Not after everything that had been sacrificed. The wind carried the faint sound of a ship's engine in the distance. Cale stopped in his tracks, straining to listen. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A small ship, barely audible above the noise of the wind. He turned in the direction of the sound and began to run. The streets of the city twisted and turned, narrow alleys leading to open courtyards and abandoned buildings. Kyle barely noticed the scenery as he ran, his mind focused solely on the distant sound of the ship. It wasn't long before he spotted it. A small, battered transport ship hidden behind a collapsed building at the edge of the city. Lyra and Joran were there, standing beside the ship. Lyra was leaning heavily against Joran, her pale face still marked by the exhaustion of her injuries. But she was awake, her eyes shining with a faint, determined light. Joran saw Cale first and waved, his expression full of relief. "You made it," Joran said, his voice full of exhaustion. "We thought you were—" "I'm fine," Kyle cut him off, his voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "We need to move. The Empire won't be far behind." Lyra turned toward him slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze that made Kyle pause. A recognition, a connection. She was the last of her people, and yet she had hope. She had survived when so many others had fallen. Cale felt a surge of admiration for her, but also a sense of urgency. They couldn't waste any more time. Lyra stepped forward, her hand resting gently on Cale's arm. "You've done more than I could have asked, but now we need to reach the heart of the resistance. There's a place where we can hide, where the Empire can't find us." Kyle nodded. He didn't know exactly what she meant by the heart of the resistance, but he trusted her. She had been his guide so far, and he couldn't afford to lose her now. "We'll get there," Cale said firmly. "But we have to hurry. The longer we stay here, the more time the Empire has to catch up." Lyra smiled faintly. "I knew you were the right person for this." Kyle didn't have the words to respond. He wasn't a hero, not in the way she thought. He was just a man trying to survive, trying to make up for the mistakes of his past. But as he looked at her, at the quiet strength she carried despite everything she had been through. He felt something stirring within him. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe in something again. Joran began to prepare the ship, checking the engines and making sure everything was ready for takeoff. Kale helped Lyra aboard, making sure she was seated comfortably before climbing, in himself. The ship's engines roared to life, and they lifted off the ground, soaring into the sky. Kale looked out the window as the city grew smaller, the ruins of his world shrinking beneath them. He turned his gaze back to Lyra, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. He knew she was still recovering from the battle, but there was a fire in her eyes that Kale couldn't ignore. She was no ordinary survivor. She was the key to stopping the Empire, and Kale wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The ship sped through the sky, leaving the shattered city behind. Kale didn't know where they were going, but he knew one thing for certain. Their journey had only just begun. The Empire would be coming for them, and they would need more than just a broken sword to defeat them. But Kale was starting to understand something important. The sword wasn't the only thing that could change the course of the war. It was the people who wielded it, the ones who refused to give up, who would make the difference, and Kale wasn't going to stop until they had won. The journey to the heart of the resistance took longer than Kale had expected. The ship, though small and battered, was surprisingly fast. Still, the longer they flew, the more Kale felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Empire was relentless. They wouldn't stop hunting Lyra, and now they were hunting him too. They made several stops along the way, hidden outposts and safe havens where the resistance fighters were preparing for the next stage of the war. Each place they visited offered Kale a glimpse into the strength of the people fighting against the Empire. It wasn't just a war of soldiers and weapons. It was a fight of survival, of hope. Everywhere they went, Kale could see the weariness in the faces of those who had fought for so long, yet still they pressed on. As they approached their destination, a remote planet known only to the resistance leaders, Kale could sense the tension in the air. Lyra had been quiet for most of the journey, her thoughts far away. Kyle didn't press her to speak. He could feel that she was carrying the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders. She had always known that her people's last hope rested with her, but now it was even more personal. She wasn't just fighting for her people anymore, she was fighting for a future. The small ship broke through the atmosphere, descending toward the planet's surface. As they neared the landing zone, Kyle caught sight of the resistance base, a hidden underground city, surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests. It looked peaceful from above, but Kyle knew that it was far from safe. The Empire's spies were everywhere. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. Joran, who had been quiet for most of the trip, spoke up as they neared the landing area. "Once we land, we'll have to be quick. The Empire doesn't give up easily, and if they've been tracking us, we'll have a fight on our hands." Kale nodded. He had been ready for a fight since the moment he picked up the sword, but the resistance had prepared. They had been fighting for years, and Kyle was beginning to see why they hadn't given up. Even in the darkest of times, they had held on to hope. It was a lesson Kale was learning himself. The ship landed softly, its engines humming as it settled into place. Kale, Lyra, and Joran disembarked quickly, making their way to a hidden entrance. The resistance had created a secure pathway to their base, where they would meet with the leaders of the resistance. But as they approached, Kyle felt a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. As they entered the underground base, Kyle was immediately struck by the sense of urgency. Resistance fighters rushed around, organizing supplies, preparing for something big. Kyle could see the tension in their eyes. He had seen it before during the days when he had worked as a blacksmith. It was the look of people, on the edge, ready to fight for everything they had left. Lyra was immediately surrounded by resistance leaders who were eager to hear from her. They had been waiting for her return, for the hope that she carried with her. She spoke to them in hushed tones, her voice carrying the weight of responsibility. Cale stayed back, watching from a distance. His role in this was still unclear. He was a blacksmith, a survivor, not a leader. But as he looked at the faces of the people around him, he realized that perhaps he was more than that. Joran came up beside him, his voice low. "You've done more than we could have hoped. Lyra's people trust her, but they also trust you. That sword you forged, it's not just a weapon, it's a symbol, and now it's a symbol of hope." Kyle frowned, not sure how to respond. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't wanted to be a hero. All he had wanted was to repair a broken sword and save a dying girl. But now the sword he had forged was something far greater. It was a weapon of power, a weapon that could change the course of the war. And in that moment, Cale realized that he was no longer just a bystander in this fight. He was part of it. The resistance leaders gathered, their voices low but urgent. They were planning their next move. Cale listened carefully, trying to make sense of the strategy. He could hear the fear in their voices, but there was something else, something stronger, determination. They were going to fight, no matter what it took. One of the leaders, a woman named Amara, turned to Cale. "We've learned that the Empire is preparing for a final assault. They're going to hit us hard. We need your help. The sword you forged, it can give us the edge we need." Kyle nodded slowly. He had never been part of a battle like this, but he knew one thing. He couldn't back down now. The Empire had already taken too much. He had already lost too much. This was his chance to make a difference. That night. Cale stood outside the base, staring at the stars. The galaxy had always seemed so vast to him, so unreachable. But now, as he looked up at the night sky, he realized how small it really was. The fight wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about the future. It was about the people who had the strength to fight for something greater than themselves. Lyra joined him, her footsteps soft on the ground. She stood beside him, looking up at the stars as well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, sharing the silence. "You're not just a blacksmith, Cale," Lyra said quietly, her voice full of understanding. "You're the hope we've all been waiting for." Cale didn't know what to say to that. He had never seen himself as a hero. But as he looked at Lyra, at the people of the Resistance, he realized something. This fight wasn't just about the sword. It wasn't just about power. It was about something deeper, something worth fighting for, and Cale was ready to fight. The calm before the storm was always the hardest. As Cale stood with Lyra on the edge of the Resistance base, looking out at the barren landscape, he could feel the weight of what was coming. They had prepared as best they could. The Resistance had gathered every available fighter, every weapon, every bit of intelligence. But even with the sword he had forged in his hands, Cale knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had always carried the burden of her people's hope, but now, as the battle loomed closer, it was more than just her people's survival at stake. It was the fate of the entire galaxy. Cale could see it in her eyes. The weight of the galaxy, of the countless lives depending on them, was pressing down on her. Yet she stood tall, her resolve unwavering. Kyle's thoughts were interrupted by the low hum of engines in the distance. His hand instinctively moved to the sword at his side. The Empire's fleet was coming. The air around them was thick with tension. The sound of warships, enormous and powerful, grew louder. Kyle had heard of these ships before. They were the Empire's pride, designed to wipe out entire cities with a single strike, and they were on their way to destroy the last hope for freedom. Joran approached, his face set with determination. "The fleet's almost here. We don't have much time." Kale nodded, his grip tightening around the sword. He had forged it for this moment. He had crafted it not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. And now, that hope would be put to the test. The resistance fighters had positioned themselves around the base, setting traps and creating makeshift defenses. Kyle didn't doubt their skill. These people had been fighting for years, and they had survived the Empire's brutality. But today, they would face their greatest challenge yet. The final battle for the galaxy was about to begin. As the fleet drew closer, Kale turned to Lyra. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes full of fire. "I've been ready my whole life," she said softly. "This is our fight, Kale, and together we'll win." Her words struck him like a lightning bolt. For the first time, Kyle understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for the future. He was fighting for a galaxy that deserved to live in peace, free from the Empire's tyranny. The first wave of enemy ships appeared in the sky, their massive forms blocking out the sun. The resistance fighters readied their weapons, their faces set with determination. They had trained for this moment, and now it was time to see if they were ready. Kyle stepped forward, holding the sword firmly in his hands. He could feel the energy within it, the power it held. It was more than just a weapon. It was a force that could change everything. As the Empire's ships descended, the sky was filled with the roar of engines and the blinding flash of energy blasts. The first wave of soldiers hit the ground, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. But Kale didn't flinch. He was ready. The battle began in an explosion of noise and chaos. Resistance fighters clashed with Empire soldiers, their weapons flashing in the air. Kyle moved through the battlefield, his sword flashing as he cut through the enemy ranks. The blade hummed with power, its energy cutting through armor and metal like it was nothing. Despite the chaos, Kale was calm. Each swing of the sword felt natural, as if it was an extension of himself. He could feel the energy flowing through him, guiding his movements. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Lyra, for the people of the Resistance, for the entire galaxy. As the battle raged on, Kale saw Lyra in the distance, fighting alongside the Resistance fighters. She was a force to be reckoned with, her movements precise and powerful. Kale had never seen anyone fight with such determination, such conviction. She was the heart of this fight, the one who had brought them all together. But even as they pushed back the first wave of soldiers, Kale knew that this was only the beginning. The Empire had more forces, more ships, and more soldiers ready to crush them. But Kyle had something they didn't have. He had hope. And he would fight with everything he had to protect that hope. As the hours passed, the battle seemed endless. The Resistance was slowly being pushed back, but Kale refused to give up. He fought with everything in him, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he cut down enemy after enemy. He knew that the fate of the galaxy rested on this battle. There was no turning back now. Just as Kyle felt himself beginning to tire, he saw the leader of the Empire's fleet approaching. The warlord who had caused so much suffering, who had destroyed so many lives, was coming for him. Kale's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the final showdown. The warlord's ship landed with a deafening crash, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The leader of the Empire emerged, his dark armor gleaming in the light. He was tall, imposing, and his eyes burned with hatred. This was the man who had taken everything from Kale, from Lyra, from the galaxy. Kale stepped forward, the sword raised high. The warlord smiled, his voice cold and mocking. "You think you can defeat me? You are nothing but a broken blacksmith with a broken sword." Kale's grip tightened on the hilt of the blade. "I'm more than just a blacksmith," he said, his voice steady. "I'm a warrior, and I'll fight for what's right." The warlord's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Kyle charged, his sword crackling with energy, as it met the warlord's weapon in a shower of sparks. The two clashed, their swords ringing out in the stillness of the battlefield. The fight was fierce, but Kale's strength was unmatched. He had forged the sword, and now it was his to wield. With one final powerful strike, Kale brought the sword down on the warlord's weapon, shattering it into pieces. The warlord fell to his knees, defeated. Kale stood over him, breathing heavily. He had won. The galaxy had won. Lyra appeared beside him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were filled with triumph. The war was over. The Empire had been defeated. Kale looked around at the resistance fighters who were cheering and celebrating. They had done it. They had freed the galaxy from the Empire's grip. As Kale stood there holding the sword in his hands, he realized something important. He had started this journey as a broken man, unsure of his place in the world. But now he understood. He had forged more than just a weapon. He had forged a future. And that future was full of hope. Lyra smiled at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "You did it, Kale. You changed everything." Kale looked out at the stars, the vast galaxy now open to them. "We did it," he said quietly. "Together."